Hey everybody, Red Mage here. Welcome back to this series where I go through different RPG products that I have and give them a quick flip through and review. Although this video is going to be different. It's going to be more akin to my grab bag videos or my collection videos. A few months ago I did a set of products that I had that were really good, I felt, for sort of a whimsical fairy tale-like world, basically for Dolmenwood. That was my thought. And it was really well received. People said, hey, you should do this for other genres. You should do this for other kinds of things. So I did like a Halloween one, and that was pretty well received too. And so I thought, I put a poll out, I think a while back, and said, okay, what kind of next grab bag video should I do? And Sword and Sorcery was at the top of the list, if not the top. Now, the other one that was up there was Grimdark. And so I have that video on the back burner somewhere. But I thought I might go through the stuff that I have that is sort of Sword and Sorcery or Sword and Sorcery leaning. There's going to be a little science fantasy in here as well. It's hard for me to find that clear divide between Sword and Sorcery and science fantasy, and so I'm going to try to find just the Sword and Sorcery genre stuff. Now, most of these are adventures or rule sets, because I think when people make a Sword and Sorcery adventure, they tend to put it either in a specific system that's built for it, at least in my experience, or they'll build an entire system for that new Sword and Sorcery style game, and that's interesting to me. That it's hard to run a Sword and Sorcery game in just any game, using any system. Or at least the number of dedicated systems, the number of Sword and Sorcery dedicated systems out there indicate to me that it's kind of a hard thing to just adapt. I think a lot of Sword and Sorcery, in my opinion, is, I mean, you could take almost any adventure and give it a Sword and Sorcery tone, just by changing the way that you describe things and by changing the sort of player expectations. But that's not sufficient, right? Because Sword and Sorcery has a very different set of rules than standard genre fantasy, right? Than high fantasy or Tolkien fantasy or anything else. It's kind of one of the two grandparents, right, of modern fantasy. Sword and Sorcery on the one hand and Tolkien on the other, with maybe fairy tales as a distant cousin or something like that, right? Much more akin to Tolkien. But and I guess there's cosmic horror in there as well, and that makes that. But that's closer definitely to Sword and Sorcery then. One of the hallmarks, as far as I can tell, of Sword and Sorcery is that magic is dangerous and dark, right? I mean, that's the idea: is that the heroes, if heroes they be, and they're not very heroic very often, right? Or accidentally heroic is maybe the best way of putting it. Heroes tend to use physical strength, their cunning, and their ingenuity. Right, you have barbarians, you have thieves. And there might be a magician here or there, right? You can think of Mako from Conan the Barbarian, right? But for the most part, you're dealing with strength, right? Physical strength or physical ingenuity, humanity. And magic is the other, right? In Sword and Sorcery, magic is the other. The gods, and that's another key difference, I think, is there isn't much of a distinction, as far as I can tell, between divine magic and arcane magic, right? Between magic that comes from the gods or powers and magic that comes from incantation and particular words. Like in Sword and Sorcery, using magic at all is sort of dealing with spirits beyond this realm. Those who do so do it at their peril. It's not a science to be mastered so much as a pact to be entered into. And I know that there are some elements of modern fantasy that have that, right? The warlock and things like that, but in 5e, for example. But I think that Sword and Sorcery just has it, that's what magic is. And so the way that it treats the world as a result are going to change. This has kind of been a diatribe. But basically, what I've tried to do is find adventures or games that fit that mindset. And I know that's just one dimension of Sword and Sorcery, right? There's the world building that goes into it. There's the particular kinds of tone you add in, the descriptions you're going to use, the kind of monsters you fight. And I think these adventures do tend that direction. But I think really the key thing that I found in these different books that I was going through were kind of what I talked about before. This idea that magic is dangerous and deadly and perhaps coming from the other world. All of it, just without exception, really. And the focus tends to be more on getting stuff, and the worlds tend to be a bit grittier and more grounded in the sense of realistic, one might say. That they could have, sort of pre-Atlantis worlds. That's sort of another element here. Anyway, going through them all, I wanted to start off with a classic I think, what will be a kind of classic adventure in a few years here, the Slumbering City by Tom Wilson. This is one that I reviewed a while back, and I've never found an adventure that I wasn't expecting, I guess, that didn't call itself straight on the cover, Sword and Sorcery or something like that, that would just fit the genre so well. So I'm going to go through this really, really briefly. There's so many. This is going to be a long video, guys, because I have tons and tons of things here to go through, as you can tell from the description. I'll try to put one entry for each element here in the description. But what we have for the Slumbering City is this sort of desert. It's a small city. I talked about this in my review of it, where I was kind of hard on it for this fact, but it's not really so much a city as it's a sort of a temple complex. I think that's what I would have called it. The Slumbering Palace or the Slumbering Temple or something like that would have been, I think, a better description for this place. But the idea is that it's this sort of time-locked palace out in the desert, and there are the Stygians, or the people who live there, and they can't get out, and because they can't get out, they have sort of put themselves to sleep rather than deal with this long kind of eternity. But in that kind of long eternity, there's this horrible dark god beneath this place that is eating people and kind of devouring things, and it's all kind of unstable, and there's treasure everywhere. And so you're just going through this city. It's a very, very Conan the Barbarian. It's very Sword and Sorcery. In fact, this book has a it's for the Shadow Dark system, and at the very back there's a Shadow Dark class for sort of a Conan the Barbarian style adventurer. It's a really good adventure. It's really good. Now, one thing I should note about most of these books is that Sword and Sorcery tends to lean into mature themes. It turns to things like nudity and things like that are going to be much more present in Sword and Sorcery kinds of books. So keep that in mind. None of the books that I'm going to be going through, well, one of them later has a bit of more explicit art, but I'm not going to try to go through all of that in this sort of video. Certainly, but keep that in mind, right? As you're going through these Sword and Sorcery, that just tends to be one of the hallmarks. You're probably not going to play a Sword and Sorcery style game for a young table, right? It's probably just not going to be a consideration. You certainly could. You just have to. You wouldn't play the full Conan the Barbarian experience, right? So anyway, this is a fantastic one. It gives you, giant animals. It gives you a giant snake. Gives you undead. It gives you an old god that needs to be destroyed. It gives you tons of treasure. Knockdown, drag-out fight. I really like this one. The Throg, the Ever Hungry. It's pretty brutal, but it's very this sort of like amorphous demon slime oozing god that's kind of, yeah, great. Classic description from some old Sword and Sorcery stuff. Well, I've reviewed this in a different video, so I'm not going to go through the rest of it there. But this is the Slumbering City. It's by Tom Wilson. Again, I was hard on it in its first review for 2 points. One of which was the fact that I don't think it's really a city, and the other, there's this sort of treasure stealing mechanic, I shouldn't say treasure stealing, but the players are going to lose some of their treasure when they leave the city, and that's not a mechanic that I'm a fan of. But the vibe of this, the writing of this, and just the overall aesthetic of it is basically spot on. So that's why I wanted to start with it. Slumbering City, I think it's one of the better Sword and Sorcery adventures out there. And on that note, Tom Wilson has a whole bunch of adventures under Throwigames is his handle there, I think. Throwigames, yeah. And I've reviewed the whole set before, and they're great, and many of them are perfect Sword and Sorcery. This one I took just as a sample because it's basically that first scene, or an early scene in Conan the Barbarian where he gets the Sword of Atlantis. This is basically, you get to play through that, and it's sort of a one-on-one adventure, maybe one with two, maybe one on two, maybe two characters or something like that. But the idea here is you're just going into an old tomb in the mountain, and there's this old Atlantean skeleton there, and there's a blade, and you can take it. It's just that scene, basically, but there's some adventuring going on in there. It's extended into a session's worth of fun. And it's a little pamphlet book. Now, all of Throwigames, as far as I know, these brochure adventures, you can find them on DTRPG and all of that. And I've reviewed them before, but there's a lot of them in there that are really, really great. And I would say, I think it's called Once So Beautiful is the other one that I really think fits really well. This cursed princess who's out in the wastes, or maybe in the sewers, or wherever you want to place her. But she's cursed with this horrible spider curse. She's not evil, and she has to be saved, or maybe she has to be saved, or maybe she's not savable, depending on how you want to tone that. But it's an interesting, a little adventure too. So I didn't want to click through that one too. But there are a bunch in that set of Throwigames that I highly recommend. There are going to be a couple shorter ones back to back here. The Temple of Dynss, or Dynss. I think it's great because you got lizard folk in the desert worshiping gods, raiding townsfolk. It's a very simple little adventure. It uses a dice and logos map. This is pay what you want, or maybe even just free on DTRPG. But it's lizard folk capturing people. It's lizard folk worshiping in their temple out in the desert, mummified warriors. Just, right in that sort of old style sword and sorcery vibe for me. Now, I know one of the interesting things about sword and sorcery is that the monsters you're fighting, right, tend to be giant monsters. They tend to be dark gods and things like that. And then they're human for the most part, right? Maybe they're like cavemen or Neanderthals or something like that, but they tend to be human for the most part. But every so often you get like snake men or something like that. And I think this would be a great sort of desert temple to add to a campaign, right? So like you have this snake cult. Now I might reflavor these guys as snake men or something like that. But you have this snake cult in the city, and of course, going out into the temple, there is this temple where they're doing their worst rituals and stuff like that. And I think you might be able to throw that into a game. Anyway, I thought it was kind of interesting. The next I'm going to look at is Her Sun-Shattered Tears. This is by Sersa Victory, and I might recommend a few of the Sersa Victory adventures because they do fit. The Caldera of the Sickle Dancer, I think, is also another good one here. And I'm going to be looking at one more later, The Lost Cave of the Worm Witch. But this one is another really good one. This is a level 0 adventure. It's sort of a gauntlet, as far as I can recall. No, this is the first level. Oh, sorry. I'm mixing up two adventures. This is not the gauntlet. This is the first level adventure where you are basically enthralled to this sorcerer queen who is sending you into a temple, and you're just trying to get out what you can get out, right? You're trying to get in there and obey her, get her magic, get her items, and not die. And that's basically it. But it's a really simple adventure. I really like the way that the map is laid out there. But mostly it's just the world building here. There's this tyrannical sorcerer queen who has this 13 city-states. It's pretty classic sword and sorcery. Yeah, one of the things that, one of the hallmarks of the adventures that we often see is sort of damsels in distress, right? This is kind of a flip on that, where the sorcerer queen is the one sending you out. But the next one is definitely not. The Sarcophagus Legion is right in that vein. This is an advanced adventure. This is module 7, designed for Osric. This is a really good adventure. I have to say, I really like this. It's pretty cliche in a lot of ways, but it's kind of what you want when you're going for a sword and sorcery game. I mean, you're looking for meeting up with a sultan. There's a caravan that's been attacked in the desert. His wife has been captured by these this cult in the desert, and you have to go try to rescue her, or maybe not. Maybe you don't really care, but hey, you might make some money, or maybe there's some enemies there. You've got a tiny hex crawl here. I mean, when I say tiny, I mean there aren't that many locations. You're just kind of going from a place to place where you're meeting up with, you go to the site of the caravan attack, and then you're maybe hit by a sandstorm, and then you can get to the site of the desert, of the cult, basically, of where they've captured her and all this stuff. And it's a pretty cool dungeon. If you know Advanced Adventures, you know their dungeon cartography is always really good. And then you get, that's the first level, and then you get the ruined temple here, which is, again, pretty good. It's fairly linear. I mean, you're looking for like room to room to room. There's not a ton of variation in that regard, but the art here is really good as well. This is a good one. Again, it's in that tone of, well, you can see from the art used here, cultists, sort of lizard-ish folk things, ritual sacrifice of helpless maidens. You can do pretty sword and sorcery on the nose, right? But I like that one. The next one is a bit different, though. I was hesitant about putting this on here because this isn't so much Conan the Barbarian sword and sorcery, but if you've read the whole Conan set, you'll know that there are other stories that are a bit more one-off, where he's up in the north or where he's up in the snowy lands or something like that are much more akin to things like Beowulf. And this is much more like Beowulf. In fact, it's basically straight out of Beowulf, Doom of the Savage Kings, which is 66.5 from DCC. It's level 1 adventure. And it's not, again, quite perfect, but I don't know, I was really drawn to this because I think you could run this as a much more sort of sword and sorcery adventure. Just because of the sort of realism and the grittiness of the world, because of the sort of barbaric quality of the villagers and of the traditions involved, and of the creature itself, and of the way it sort of comes, like the ways to defeat it and things like that. It's not just, hey, we're going to go kill this guy. Like, you have to try to like find a way to destroy it, and one of those is with mortal strength, which I think is kind of cool. And that seems like something out of a sword and sorcery game. I mean, that's, again, what happens in Beowulf with Grendel, right? But just even the way that it starts with the villagers going to burn this witch, or they think, not necessarily a witch, but they're just going to burn this, well, again, burning is the wrong word. It's not really a burning. It's a sacrifice, right? They're going to burn this girl. Anyway, I just think that it would fit in with that kind of a world that you're going to build. I've reviewed this one before. I really like this adventure quite a lot. And it's, again, is it perfect? Is it exactly right for sword and sorcery? No, but I think it would fit with a particular world. If you were to put this in and start this as sort of a sword and sorcery style campaign, you could start an adventure here, and maybe eventually the characters make their way south, and they get to the more traditional sword and sorcery setting or something like that. But I don't know. I think this could be quite good. It reminds me of something more like the 13th Warrior, which, if you've seen, puts me in a sword and sorcery mindset rather than strict fantasy. Anyway, again, I'm not sure exactly why. So I think this is a good one. The village of Heorot instead of Heorot. I like this one a lot. This adventure, even though I've never actually run it, has a special place in my heart. The Doom of the Savage Kings. Now the next is very weird and very different, and it's much more on the science fantasy than strict sword and sorcery. This is Chanters in the Dark, also by DCC. There were a whole bunch of other DCC adventures that I initially had lined up to include, and then I took them out because I thought they leaned too much into science fantasy and too much into the gonzo, away from sword and sorcery. This one I thought actually did a pretty good middle ground between those two. There's one later that I included. It's super gonzo. I just included it because I had to, because it has so many good ideas in it that you could use in almost any campaign, but especially more gonzo-y, science fantasy, leaning towards the sword and sorcery kind of game. Anyway, back on this one. Chanters in the Dark is a really cool adventure because what you're dealing with here is this underground city, the Lost City. And whenever you're dealing with a lost city under the ground, my mind goes to the origins of the genre, right? Things like Journey to the Center of the Earth, things like The Mysterious Island, things like Conan the Barbarian, right? Robert E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, they were heavily influenced by H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and these late 19th century writers. And so I think this one feels more like that as well. You're going down into the earth, you're finding this big city where there are these hideous creatures, and there's a meteor that's crashed down there, and you get the side view, and it looks just perfect, right? This underground city. I love this. I love the Lost City. Anything with an underground city that's massive is just right up my alley. I had this. I ran the Gates of Firestorm Peak, is I think what it's called, a few years ago, actually quite a few years ago now, but I modified it heavily. It was the sort of capstone to a long campaign I'd been running up to that point, so I decided to adapt that dungeon and that setting for my game. And the players made it through the market, and they made it through the sort of twisting chaos halls, and then instead of having them go straight into the final area, I had them pass by this sort of this underground cliff that was overlooking a massive underground chasm, or cavern, that's the word, massive, miles deep, and they could see all the way down into it. And the reason they could see all the way down into it was that deep down there was this glowing green and gold city that they could see, like with domes and spires and things way down there. And the adventure had nothing to do exactly with that, except it was influencing some of the bad guys. And so I described it, and the players were like, oh man, that's awesome, we should go down there. They never got a chance to in that campaign. The campaign wrapped up, they fought the bad guy, and they knew that there were guys, pulling the strings behind the scenes that were all the way down in that other city, but they had finished the main problem. They had shut down the thing that was really causing it, and they got back to the surface, and then the campaign kind of ended. We kind of played a side campaign with a couple of the characters for another year or so in another direction. We didn't go back down there. That was fun, and I've always wanted to go back to the idea of the underground city. I've never run it that way. So anyway, Lost City of Quatat. It's a cool idea here. Going down through the city, finding the temple, and then escaping into the final fight. If you know DCC Adventures, then you'll know that this is a great one, because they're all great. I mean, they're all really fun. They're all really well put together. There's just a sort of delight in a DCC that I really appreciate. And Chanters in the Dark is no exception. But I think you could easily adapt this. Again, one of the things that I find is that the tone that you describe things with is going to be key here. Right? That if you're going to play a genre fantasy game or a genre game at all, you cannot just rely on the player's own imagination and just on, the facts on the ground, so to speak, like the fact that you're fighting a giant snake, or the fact that you're fighting, cultists who are trying to sacrifice a maiden, or the fact that you're, dealing with an evil sorcerer who's trying to awaken a dead god, whatever. That's not sufficient to get the sword and sorcery tone. You're going to have to do your own research here. So when you're talking about running a sword and sorcery campaign or game, I've only run one, really, and I made sure to just lean in at every opportunity to the touchstones of the world that I was building, which was very, sword and sorcery, I felt. And it worked really well. So but again, it wasn't just because of the players were, one of the players was the daughter of a barbarian tribal queen who was trying to raise a dead dragon from the earth and going to these old tombs to do so and being escorted there by these barbarian companions. It was very Conan the Destroyer. I was probably heavily influenced by it when I kind of put the campaign together. All right, so again, Chanters in the Dark I think is a great one. The next here is the Tomb of Ostrabaris. This is one I reviewed, I think, twice. This will be my third review. This is the gauntlet I was thinking of earlier. The gauntlet for level 0 characters, 24 plus level 0 characters. So this is a massive gauntlet by Lost Heretic Press. And this one is really good because it's like, here's a tomb, here's a dungeon. You're just going to go in, it's a death trap. And you could easily put this into your world as maybe it's the characters are members of a group, maybe they're members of a league, maybe they're simply just adventurers at the local tavern and you're having them go through one at a time, or you just run the adventure as is, which is that they're being forced into it by this group of sort of archaeologist cultists, sort of, who are going in there and they're sending you as their sacrifices just to get the stuff out that they want. And you don't really have a choice. Either you die outside or you go in and at least try to make it out. It's a good idea. It's a really, really good idea for an adventure. And it fits with the overall tone. Again, you'd have to shift some things, but that's going to be true for almost any of these. It's just adapt something. Sword and sorcery is not, as far as I can tell, there isn't the same sort of dedicated, I don't even know what you would call it, dedicated bundle of perfectly toned adventures that there are for other genres. You can find a million H.P. Lovecraft, cosmic horror adventures. You can just find tons of those. You can find, ever since, Morkborg and all that, you can find these, despair punk worlds. I don't even know what you call them. Despair, porn worlds. I don't like those, personally. I think they're terrible. When I say that, I just mean, going all in on the whole, everything's dark and everything's broken and everything's evil and just reveling in that. I personally don't like that at all. But that's, you can find a ton of those. The Dark Souls, the Bloodborne worlds, all that stuff. But the sword and sorcery, perfect adventure genre, the bundle, is not something that I have a ton of experience with. I haven't found a lot of them. So it's a little bit harder to find, unfortunately, because I think that would be great if there were a ton of them. But the next couple that I'm going to go through were designed specifically sword and sorcery adventures. This is the Caverns of Shennog, and I'm going to go through the Crypt of Kursaba in a minute here. They're designed for Argosa, which the Lost Tales of Argosa is, in fact, a sword and sorcery setting or a sword and sorcery system. And the world in Argosa, the sandbox that was, I'm not sure if it was originally designed to be a bit of a sandbox world and these adventures were going to be placed around it or what. But it's intentionally leaning into that idea and those tropes. And I think it is a really, really good idea. I've reviewed this one before and I had very good things to say about it for good reason. It's a great adventure. The layout is awesome and the descriptions are great. but the tone of it is very, very good. Pretty much exactly what you want. Corrupted human sorcerer or something sorcerer who has become obsessed with this fake god, maybe. Is it fake? Is it not? What's going on here? And then these other kind of demi-human things that have sort of gathered around him or that are already there, the Nagora. Devolved forms of Cyclops, huge albino creatures that are terrifying. They're not evil exactly, but they're not great. And then there's horrible wormy creatures, and it's just really good. It's just really good. I think the Caverns of Shennog is a great entry into that category that I was talking about of sort of sword and sorcery, maybe on the nose, sword and sorcery's adventures. And I think the same thing is true for the Crypt of Kursaba, which again is one that I reviewed here. Kursaba the Crow-Faced has Master Balak. Those are sort of the things that are going on here. There's some rumors here, and well, again, I've reviewed this adventure, so I'm not going to go through it in too much detail. But the Crypt of Kursaba is another really, really good one. And once again, it makes great use of the Dyson Logos maps that are maybe a little less common. I think there's a few Dyson Logos maps that I've seen a bunch that people tend to go to for one reason or another. But this one makes use of a really good one, maybe a good set of them that I really like. You can see, and again, it's just laid out very, very well, very, very well, with the color coding and everything like that. But the thing, again, the thing that makes this so particularly spot on is the tone that is being given through the description of the places and through the stuff that you're fighting and all of that. So as long as you lean into that, I think you'll do a good job of getting that sword and sorcery vibe across to your own players. All right. The next one here is the Sunken Temple of Set. This is a level 7 adventure, and I think it's the only 5e or 5e product that I have in the entire list. But level 7 for 5th edition, if you guys know, that's a really high level. I mean, you're dealing with some very powerful enemies here. So if you're going to adapt this to an OSR system, you're going to have to do some really serious work to make sure this isn't totally overpowered, because you can't run this as is for a level, for an OSR game. Even a level 7 OSR team is probably, going to get wrecked by this adventure. But it's really good. It's it's again on the nose sword and sorcery. This is a side adventure for a Dark Tower campaign, which you can get from Goodman Games. This is by Chris Doyle. You've got some new weapons, a Khopesh, a Makana, and a Mace Axe, which is pretty cool. And as you'll see, it's got a really cool temple that you're kind of dealing with. It's not a very long adventure. It's only 24 pages here. You got some skeletons, or not skeletons, what am I talking about? Alligators, these massive alligators, sort of. And then the temple itself. And I love the map of the temple. Really, really well done. Just the motifs on it, the details on it, but also the actual isometric, slightly isometric view of things. It's Goodman Games, so you know it's going to be good, right? Goodman Games knows they know what they're doing. But again, this is a high-level adventure. The Were-Crocodile High Priest. That's pretty cool. So, but again, high level. So this is one that if you're going to get, you got to be careful, right? You got to be careful about just running this or adapting this, because you might just run into a really serious problem. All right, the next one is the Tomb of the Serpent Kings, which is very different and might be a bit surprising because it's not specifically anything, right? It's specifically OSR. It's specifically old school game training, right? Like that's what this is. Like what are you, I really do think of this as like OSR training. And that's how the game even lays itself out. It says, right, this is like teaching you how to run and teaching you how to play in the OSR. But I think it actually is a very, very good, sword and sorcery adjacent adventure. You have this idea of the tomb out in the desert. You have these old serpent kings, right? You have it now infested with these goblinoids, but you could easily change those, right, to almost anything. And you could make them sort of devolved humans or whatever you want to do. Snake men, creatures like that. I don't think it would be so hard to do. And just this, the general presentation of this is really, really good and gets you into this mindset. At least it gets me into this mindset of dangerous dungeon delving for the sake of getting treasure, which is the hallmark of Sword and Sorcery. It is not, it's not high fantasy down here. It is not high fantasy. So even something like this creature, I've never known how to say this Ixamanter. It's a desiccated human upper body wrapped in robes, the lower body of a skeletal snake with magical charms and trinkets wrapped around its neck. 2 red eyes burning like needles of fire, snake fangs, and it's never rude. It's the kind of creature, I don't know if you guys remember the Conan the Barbarian. It's where he first sees the Naga snake thing, right? Where he sees the snake with the human face. And it's a really actually good story. It's where he's raiding the temple. I think it's Conan. Anyway, just the way that snake thing is described is so good. And I think that this, again, it's not quite the same. This is a lich. This is a horrible creature here. But the way that this could affect your players might be the same as that Howard was affecting you there. So I don't know. I think the Tomb of the Serpent Kings, it's one of those adventures that it's just really good. It's really good. It's Skirples. I like Skirples. And I think if you're going to start off a Sword and Sorcery campaign with a dungeon crawl, especially if you want players to really be hammered into that mindset of dangerous, creepy, dark, magical stuff happening, we're raiding tombs to get money, we're not heroes necessarily, then Tomb of the Serpent Kings might be a great one to start with. Sailors on the Starless Sea. Now this one was one that I was very hesitant to include as well, because it's more, how to put it, not really sword and sorcery, although it does have a lot of like classic elements of law and chaos. It just feels more old school than sword and sorcery. So, looking back, I probably could have taken this off this list. I just wanted to include it because I think it's fun. It's a fun adventure. Look at this art. But it is pretty gonzo. It does end with the group climbing up a ziggurat to try to rescue some people from a cult. So a pyramid rising up out of the sea. So that's pretty sword and sorcery. But I still think maybe this one's a bit more just old school D&D vibey rather than particularly that. But if you haven't seen this one, you might as well check it out because it's a good adventure, and you could easily again adapt things slightly so that the chaos that they're facing is less to do with like chaos in the full sense, chaos beasts and things like that, but more has to do with a snake cult or against something like that, or a beast man cult or something like that, where you could lean into that a bit more and make them more humanoid than just these chaos creatures like this. All right, the next is the Prison of Meneptah, or Meneptah. And once again, this is an advanced adventure module. This is number 4. This is another high level one. This is for character levels 8 to 10. And that's pretty rare. You don't often find old school games for creatures that are, or for characters that are that high of a level. This is a multi-planar adventure as well, or at least it deals with some planar portals or wizards that were constructing planar portals, I should say. And so when you're dealing with that, it might be a bit beyond what most people are going to be expecting from a Sword and Sorcery game. But you do kind of want a higher level, start to get into the cosmic stuff, right? I mean, Sword and Sorcery towards the end is dealing with gods and portals to other worlds and dimensions and things like that. So it does sort of push towards that, you can see why science fantasy and Sword and Sorcery do blend. But the world that's being built up here is pretty dang good in terms of it's this desert with sultans and caravans and dervishes, and it's a world that could easily lend itself to some Sword and Sorcery dungeon crawling out in the desert. I'm not sure why I always associate Sword and Sorcery with sort of deserty, wasteland locations, but that's certainly not the case. Even within Conan the Barbarian, though, I do tend to almost picture Mediterranean, except for when he's explicitly like in the far north and it's snowy or something like that. I do tend to picture like Mediterranean adjacent regions. Almost all the places that he visits, I tend to picture that in my mind. I'm not sure exactly why. But anyway, you've got some really interesting ideas here, and the Prison of Meneptah is a cool kind of climactic place to get to at the end here. So is this perfect? Again, no, it's not perfect in terms of the tone toward sorcery. It's a higher fantasy, but you're dealing with mummies, and you're dealing with Meneptah, and you're dealing with dervishes and deserts, and I love the art on the front cover there. Or this is technically the front cover. This is the inside cover. The front cover and back are always together, which I actually like those too. But this is just the inside cover, which I think is great. So anyway, I think you guys could check that one out, the Prison of Meneptah, especially if you do want sort of a higher level game, a higher level adventure, which is kind of rare. Again, I think that's fun. The next here is a level 1 DCC fantasy city adventure called Secret of the Whispering God. This one pretty much just came out like a couple months ago. I kickstarted this a while back. It's 36 pages, it's for DCC, and what I like about it is that it is a city adventure, and that's not that common, but it's really common in things like Conan the Barbarian. It's really common in Sword and Sorcery to deal with nobles and corrupt nobility and temples in the city, and, you know, obviously robes and things like that. And this is very clearly leaning into, yeah, it says here, Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, or Leiber. I've actually never known how to say it, if it's Leiber or Lieber. But it's leaning into that style of things, and I really like that. So because of that, it's low fantasy, less gonzo, right? More low fantasy, more sword and sorcery, less gonzo. And I think that tends to be the style. I do like gonzo from time to time. It's pretty gruesome. But I tend to prefer the low fantasy sword and sorcery of the two, if I'm going to talk about that. Science fantasy too, sometimes I really like. What I really like is sort of an injection of science fantasy, suddenly, surprisingly, but not throughout a work. Like finding a laser gun, I think that is kind of great in a game, or finding like something that's very clearly a reference to aliens or something. I find that great. But then I want to go back to old low school fantasy, old, you know, low magic fantasy, sword and sorcery. I don't want to stay so much in science fantasy in my games. Brief map of the city here. It's called Karena, I think is how you would say that. And there's a rule here. It's kind of interesting for a reminder of how DCC does subdual damage, because you're probably not going to want to murder your way through the city or through the nobles' houses and the mansions you're kind of set to explore. That's kind of funny because, I don't know, I think very often players, especially in a sword and sorcery game, do tend to play kind of morally ambiguous characters, and one of the things that players tend to be ambiguous about is whether killing guards is bad. They just tend to do it and be like, oh, it's not that bad. Obviously, it's not morally ambiguous at all. It's just pretty much evil, but hey. So anyway, I think this is a great one. You guys should check this one out. Maybe I'll do a full review of it at some point. In this video, I just wanted to point it out because it is explicitly going for that Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber tone in a city adventure. And you've got a manor that you're trying to explore, right? Temples beneath cults, which is they're trying to do bad stuff, and you're trying to stop them. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but by Gregory Harris, this is just a low-level adventure. I like it. Like some things kind of take me out of the DCC. Like the font choice, for example, it doesn't scream sword and sorcery to me. The layout doesn't scream sword and sorcery, and I think little things like that are really important in a book that's like the presentation should be consistent with the tone that it's trying to bring about, and this doesn't really. The art does, cover does, and the content does, but the presentation doesn't really. So leaving that aside, I think this is great. So again, I'll put links below to where you can get all of this stuff, guys. But I'm going to have to keep going. I mean, we're really not even halfway through, and I'm already 40 minutes in. This is going to be a long video. The next one I wanted to cover is Old School Essentials. This is, I think this is the second. Yes, this is the second volume. I went through the second one first because it only has one adventure that I wanted to cover, and that's the Ravener's Ghat. This is another high-level adventure. It's level 6 through 8. This is heavily influenced by Indian mythology. Indian religion, or I shouldn't say Indian religion, by Indian, like the Hindu religion, and Indian mythology. And that's pretty rare in Western fantasy. We often don't go into Eastern fantasy at all. And so for that reason, I think this is quite fun. The art in this one is really good. By the way, this is part of the old school. I think I got halfway through this and then didn't finish it before. This is part of the Old School Essentials Adventure Anthology Volume 2. That's what I meant to say earlier. Old School Essentials Adventure Anthology number 2, and this is the last entry in that. So you have a great map here of this temple up in the mountains where these enlightened things have gone a little bit bad, shall we say. You've got some great art throughout. It really is brilliant, and it would give you I think for most of us who are familiar with sort of Western fantasy, again, it would give you a nice injection of, new mythology, new kind of setting for your fantasy, for your sword and sorcery, for your adventure. Conan's always come in contact with these new religions and these new gods and these new monks and cultures and things that he's never encountered before. And I think that would be a great thing for your players too, if they're not familiar with Eastern mythology, Eastern fantasy and that sort of thing. Then this would be an interesting one to add into your game, especially in conjunction with something I'm going to cover later, Yoon-Suin, which I think would work really well with something like the Ravener's Ghat. So anyway, I think this is a really cool one. And the fact that it's level 6 through 8 is a really good element too, because we have tons of low-level stuff. We don't have higher level stuff. Dealing with a Rakshasa. That's always cool. The next one I want to look at is the Sunbathers. This is one that I have talked about before, and this is awesome. I love the Sunbathers. It really does feel Mediterranean, which is why it does feel sword and sorcery to me. It also has this element of magic and those who are practicing it not necessarily being good, even if they appear to be. Really, this one, you could throw this into an island hopping adventure very, very easily. The fact that you're fighting just a lion, or a potential lion, that's awesome. Because, lions are terrifying, and just to fight one would be horrifying, and it's much more sword and sorcery than everything being, doesn't have to be a displacer beast, right? You just have a lion. In fact, too many displacer beasts make everything seem kind of eh. You have a bunch of lions and then suddenly a displacer beast. Now that's scary, right? You're fighting lions the whole time. Now there's this weird thing. So I think this is really cool. And the cult here is also pretty creepy. What they're trying to do is pretty creepy. And there's a really cool lion there. The White Lion Guardian. Now, the last one I also wanted to cover in this book is The Comet That Time Forgot, and this is awesome. This is a little gonzo, but it just feels so much like that old cartoon Fire and Ice. And, you could take off if you wanted. You could just take out the whole, hey, we passed through a portal, and now we're stuck on a comet hurling through space. One side of it is on fire, the other side is frozen, and the middle is kind of okay, and we're dealing with that. Because what you're dealing with here are dinosaurs and Neanderthals and white apes and giant animals and giants and ice princesses who have been captured by fire giants and, T-Rexes, and it's just pretty dang awesome. And if you wanted that tone, this is pretty perfect. The Neanderthal zone, it's the blue zone. This is the princess of the Neanderthals has been captured by the fire giant Lord Uther. And you got to travel from one side to the other to rescue her, or maybe not. Maybe we want to do something else. There are white apes. There are lizard folk in there. There's a giant turtle. There's a giant eyrie. There's some dragons. This is just, I don't know how you pack this much awesome tone and flavor into one adventure. But The Comet That Time Forgot, it's level 9+, so it's really high level. But The Comet That Time Forgot just deserves to be better well known if it isn't already. It's so good. So I highly recommend this one. I think you guys should put this into a campaign. It should be great. Okay, the next one here is The Lost Caves of the Worm Witch. This is another good adventure. It's much lower level. This is by Sersa Victory. This one feels much more traditional in a lot of ways, but the way it's being presented, the sort of content you're talking about is definitely sword and sorcery. It's definitely lower fantasy. It's definitely less magic. Low magic, maybe is one way of putting it. That being said, you're still dealing with a purple worm, and you're dealing with these scorpion men, which is pretty cool. I like scorpion men, but that sounds pretty old school to me. There's an interesting element in this book of songbooks and song titles. Now, this is one that I've reviewed a while back, so you guys can go find that. Again, I'm not going to go through it in too much detail here. But once again, you're dealing with an abandoned temple, a ruin underneath the earth, and some ghostly scorpions and barbarians, border raiders. There's acid rain outside. There's a tiered necropolis inside. Scorpion's dust, sacred scorpion dust trap, man scorpion mound, venom baths. It sounds pretty cool, huh? There's also some kobolds in here, which, again, if you don't want to use kobolds, because maybe you're like, hey, I don't want kobolds in my sword and sorcery game, then make them pygmy humans, or make them humans. Make them some sort of, devolved thing. Don't have to make them kobolds as the alien race, or the creature, the species. And that's one thing that I would say is that when you're dealing with sword and sorcery, just consider replacing a lot of stuff with more standard stuff. Replace a lot of the alien, again, I keep saying alien, a lot of the other, races and species and things, ancestries as they call them in Shadowdark. Replace them with humans. And maybe different humans from different places. Maybe they have different cultures worth of humans, and that's where they get their abilities from if you want to have some for the players. And then for the creatures you're running into, consider using giant creatures instead of some variation, right? Instead of using an owlbear, use a frenzied giant, boar or something like that. Instead of using, oozes, maybe consider some sort of horrible, I don't know, some sort of like snake that has this sort of melting venom or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, try to consider adapting things. And maybe you don't even have to change the stats, but adapt the way that it's described and the way that it moves and the way that your players see it in their mind so that it feels more sword and sorcery. And I think this is pretty good with a few changes there. There's a Bodak in here, by the way, which is really terrifying. And that's the sort of creature that I think would fit very well into a sword and sorcery game. I'm not sure exactly why, because I think it's vaguely human. Maybe that's why. Bodak was once human, right? That's the sort of thing you want in sword and sorcery. If you're going to come across a horrible creature, it's something that was once something else. It was human, or it was an animal, or something like that. That's cool. So the Lost Caves of the Worm Witch, I think, is really good. And again, you guys can check out the full review that I've done before, but I think that would be worth going through here. Now, the next few that I'm going to be doing are basically not really adventures. They're sort of more like setting books. Setting books that you'll be able to draw tons of inspiration from for your sword and sorcery game. And the first one is Through the Valley of the Manticore, which is fantasy, but the setting itself fits right in my mind of sort of a sword and sorcery game. The town that you have is sort of this sort of caravan stopping point through the valley. The monster itself is from the Middle East mythology, right? It's the Manticore. And I think that's from Middle East mythology. I think that's from the Sumerian, although I might now be mixing up Manticores with things like the Sphinx and the... there's one more that has like the beard, head of a man, the body of a lion, and the beard. I forget what I'm thinking of. There's some creature from the mythology of the it's not the Chaldeans, but it's the Babylonians, somewhere around there. Anyway, I'm thinking the Manticore falls into that vein. You could give it a human head or a human face or something like that, right? You got these jackal men, right? Again, it fits. It really does fit. I love the art in this book. It's so good. So Through the Valley of the Manticore, Jacob Fleming. This is another really good one that I've reviewed before. But you can see the art is just perfect, and the tone is just right on, right? Sundu Zara, the caravan merchant lord. Yeah, this is great. I think you could easily just throw this into you could throw your players into this game, have them be at this place, and you have and the Hularor canyon, and you have a great place to explore. You've got the hyena men, of course the gnolls, but you don't have to call them gnolls, right? And in fact, I would advise you to not call them gnolls. Oh, you have a great scorpion man here. So anyway, I think this is another good one for a sword and sorcery style game through the Valley of the Manticore. Especially, again, if you have everything be these sort of human or humanoid things, mostly human, mostly giant creatures, and then there's this one weird thing, the Manticore itself, which is this beast from myth and story, and it's, you know, some cursed temple guardian or something like that. Instead of just a Manticore, make it a specific thing, right, that was brought about to curse one of the, or as a result of a curse on one of the caravan merchants or something like that. You know, you build it up. You gotta do some work. You can't just run these things as is. But it'd be great if you use this, I think. The next one I wanted to cover here is the Judge's Guide to Nehwon, or Nehwon, or Nehwon. I never know how to say that either. Nehwon, whatever it is. This is the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser world. And there's a whole setting, Lankhmar, right, that you can get for DCC, and it's one of my favorite box sets, I think, for any world. It comes with the Judge's Guide, it comes with the City of the Black Toga, it comes with a whole bunch of things, and they're all really good. They're all really good, and yeah, just a whole bunch, just like a starting adventure. But this is just great if you want that world, right? This is not. It's not based on it. It's not. It just is that world. the god or the world from that book set by Fritz Leiber, by Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, or about Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. And so, if you're interested in just playing in that world, well, then get this box set, right? I mean, then you're all set. You have a sword and sorcery world right here. Everything's set out for you: the gods, the cities, the calendar, the potables, the way the magic works here, specifically within the DCC system, which is awesome. And DCC, the magic system of DCC, it's a little gonzo, but the basic idea of it is right in the realm of sword and sorcery, right, where magic is dealing with particular gods, magic is dangerous, magic is going to explode and kill you most likely. Even the best of wizards is not in complete control of their magic. That's cool, and that's straight out of sword and sorcery, right? That is the low magic, low fantasy style of play, where the players can't just simply rely on their spells like they have an ammo pouch of spells. They can just cast them the way that you shoot a gun, which is 5e, right? Which is the sort of fire and prepare and then forget. But even within that world, right, where the 5e or where the DnD magic system comes from, the prepare and forget, fire and forget magic system, within the world in which it was designed, it made sense. It doesn't make that much sense in the other worlds of D&D that have sort of followed since. Spell slots don't make a ton of sense on their own. So anyway, the Judge's Guide to Nehwon, or Nehwon. Again, I don't know how to say that. Would be really great. This one is another adventure. This is Escape from Miklagard, but it's more of a setting than I think an adventure, because you get. Yes, the city, this getting out of the city is a big part of the adventure, but the city itself is detailed quite a lot, and the world in which the city is set is detailed quite a lot. Again, this is another one that I've reviewed before. The idea here is that the city has fallen, and you're trying to get out of the city as it's falling, and there's things falling apart. It's sort of a point crawl adventure. I think you're not going through the city street by street. You're generating it. Maybe the DM is generating it as you go, or just before you play, and you have to go through a certain number of neighborhoods and regions, and there's going to be something happening in them as you go through, and the players are going to have to find a way to deal with it or not as they try to get out of the city. But the city itself feels Roman, right? It feels Aquilonian, right? It feels like the great city, and I think that the fact that it's falling would be perfect as a start to a sword and sorcery campaign, right? That there is this great city that is now falling, and you got to get out, and that's how the campaign begins. City burning around you. First couple sessions are you getting out of the city, and then you're now let loose into a world where the great power has fallen. That's sword and sorcery stuff. I think that would be great. This is a pretty big book too. There's 146 pages, tons of stuff, as you can see, tons of stuff to encounter. Escape from Miklagard. This is for the Sword of Cepheus 2nd edition, which is a system that is designed for sword and sorcery. So it would fit, obviously, with that system. Therefore, it would fit with the genre. I think it's a good addition to the whole genre, too. Okay, well, we're getting along, but we're still got a few to go. Quite a few to go. The next one I wanted to look at is Let Us Build a Tower, which is a mythic Bronze Age adventure in Babel. I've reviewed this one before as well, but this is great if you want that mythic quality to sword and sorcery, right? The kinds of weird creatures you're going to encounter are the kinds of weird creatures you encounter in things like Babylonian mythology, right? And so you're going to have that here. Just this horrible dark magic tower where the Tower of Babel itself, the Tower of the Gods, or Tower to God, and all of the chaos and corruption and curses that have come from it. Would be a great thing to just put into your world, right? You can build a world that has nothing to do with Babel, nothing to do with actually our world. You put in a tower like the Tower of Babel and you take the story. Because that's one thing about sword and sorcery, right? Is the world's a sword and sorcery. It's our world, but it's not our world. And so you can adapt things from our world, like the stories of the Tower of Babel, into your world. And if it's sword and sorcery, players are going to go, okay, oh, that's Babel, I get it, but it's in this world, and they'll accept it. And so you can just adapt this really, really well. Well, the Tower of Babel, it's essentially a massive dungeon generator. I've talked about this one before. The art in it is so good. But it's also, it's a little system, it's a setting, it is a mega dungeon, sort of, but it's a procedurally generated mega dungeon, or rather it's a mega dungeon that's generated differently each time you go through because it changes on you. Because that's one of the hallmarks of Babel, is that it changes when you go into it, or the tower. And so you've just got tables and tables and tables and tables and tables of stuff, rooms and example floors and encounters you can have in those rooms, and just pages and pages and pages of, look at that art, man. This is definitely leaning into the mythology side of a sword and sorcery low magic game, and it's not going to be low magic by the end, but that's okay, right? That's okay. I think Let Us Build a Tower is a brilliant, brilliant book, and I don't even think it's fully out yet, but it is a brilliant one, and I think this would really, really work. The next one here is Khosura, King of the Wastelands. This is a city and wilderness setting for levels 3 to 8. This is by the Echoes from Fomalhaut set, and this one is by Gabor Lux. I've reviewed this one recently. Brilliant. This is one of my favorite recent releases, despite the fact that it does have some AI art. It's incidental. It's not the end of the world. I know I've had comments on the other video where people were like, nope, that's it. One guy was like, I saw AI in the thing, so I'm going to stop the video too. I won't watch a video in which you talk about it. I'm like, okay, fair enough. That's your choice. You can do that. I'm not as offended by it as other people. I don't like it. It's not my favorite. It's not a deal breaker for me most of the time. In this book, it is incidental, and there is also full page, beautiful art that is paid for and comes from well-respected artists in the field. So it doesn't bother me, especially when I consider how good the book is. How good the book is. It really is awesome. The idea here is there's a city-state. The lower city is flooded, and all the people there are dead, pretty much, or evacuated. And now you have all the merchants and slavers and all those things, packed shoulder to shoulder with refugees and caravanners. And the nobles are now trying to deal, like, how are we going to deal with this? And meanwhile, there's just this massive undercity mega dungeon that you can run into. This is such a great, great city. And it's essentially kind of a city adventure, but also a mega dungeon adventure underneath the city in the various levels that go down into the earth. Let me see if I can find the side view of it briefly. Here's the upper city. I'm going to click forward until I get to the undercity. Here you go. You get the undercity. So those are the different major levels of undercity. And there are lots of empty rooms, lots of blank rooms. Quite a few, actually. And you could either use those as just empty rooms, or you could fill them yourself and develop your own extra areas of this undercity, because you can make it as big or as small as you want. But Khosura, this is 168 pages, and it has the whole dungeon down here. This is just Undercity 1A, right? And you get this massive undercity, but you can see that there's a lot of non-keyed locations, so plenty of room to even expand past what you have here. In fact, based on this, most of the rooms are unkeyed. There's still a lot of rooms, but it's mostly unkeyed. You could do what you want with this undercity. But there is definitely enough here that you wouldn't have to add anything and it would still be fully engaging and enjoyable. Great side view of this area here. Now, I want to jump ahead because not only do you get the city, but you get the wasteland outside it. And so you get a bit of a hex crawl too, with lots of other locations, some dungeons. Here's the Desert of Regulator, sounds like. And just a whole bunch of extra locations, and again, dungeons and factions and NPCs and monsters and cool stuff to find and run into. So this is great. I highly recommend Khosura. This came out of nowhere. I didn't even know it was out, and I was just clicking through DTRPG, and I was like, oh, that looks like Peter Mullen art. And I clicked on it, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. So, highly recommend you guys check this one out. The next is another one of these setting books, Operation Unfathomable. Now, this is highly gonzo, highly science fantasy, vaguely sword and sorcery. I mean, just because those genres are touching at times. But there are so many good ideas in this book that you would be, I would say, mistaken not to take a look at it if you really want to run a sword and sorcery kind of game, especially if you are okay with more gonzo science fantasy stuff. High fantasy, high ridiculousness side of things. If you do, then this book has a lot there. If you're really like, no, that's not sword and sorcery, I don't blame you. Then I would say just, you can skip this. But even so, tons of good ideas down here. Tons of good ideas. And this book is just fun to read through. So, I don't know. Check it out if you think it is the sort of thing that you might want. I have a review on it. You can watch that and then decide if it fits. Look at this guy. Obviously not sword and sorcery. Obviously gonzo science fantasy. But there is enough tangential, I would say touching. Especially when you're not looking at the underworld here, but when you're looking at the overworld. The next book, which is the second half of it. Let me quickly jump to it. This is where is it? Maybe they don't format it that way exactly, but the surface world. I reviewed it in my other video. Yeah, well, I don't have it here, but there's the overland, the odious uplands, which goes along with the Unfathomable. Yeah, maybe it's not in this particular combination. It might be. I didn't find it, but the odious uplands, and I think that has a bit more traditional sword and sorcery stuff going on. But even so, it's still pretty gonzo. It's still pretty science fantasy. So keep that in mind. The next one is Yoon-Suin, and I have done a full review of this, and I think this would be perfect for that particular kind of tone. If you're more open to some more Eastern influence in your game, rather than this traditional Western fantasy that we tend to play. But this is really cool. Yoon-Suin is really cool, and the ideas here. I mean, this book is just full of ideas. This is 389 pages, so reading through this book is going to be a thing first. Like, you're going to have to read through it, maybe even a couple times. But there's so many ideas for a low fantasy, real lived-in world that Yoon-Suin. I don't know, man. This is just like it's almost not even fair how many great ideas are in here relative to how hard it is to read. How hard it is to get through so many pages and the layout and the sort of font, and it's just all like just so much great ideas, so many great ideas. But if your players if you want your players to be in a new area, a new world, you want them to travel from the sort of traditional place to do like a sort of Marco Polo adventure or something like that, I think this would be amazing. This would be great. So Yoon-Suin, again, I've done a review, sort of a review of it. There's other reviews you can read on the YouTube, or read online or watch on YouTube. I would say check it out. And again, it's the sort of thing where if you find it to be the kind of world you want to play in, then you can play a sword and sorcery game here very, very easily, I think. Okay, the next two are part 1 and part 2 of a 3-part series. The third part isn't out yet. And they're not exactly sword and sorcery, once again. In fact, they're pretty high fantasy. Gods of the Forbidden North. But there is a lot of really cool influence here. And I think if you want the vibe, especially if you want to be up in the north, the frozen north, the frigid north, the barbarians, then you've got a good source book here. I don't know about the city so much. I don't know about the adventure paths so much. I'm not even sure about the dungeons so much as fitting with that. But the hex crawl and the world building and the various factions and the various places you can encounter out in the wilderness and the various monsters you can encounter, very much in tone, I would say. The art is so good also. So I would recommend that you guys check this out again. I've done reviews, flip-throughs and reviews of both Book 1 and Book 2. Book 3 is currently being kickstarted. So good. You can see there's a lot of influence beyond, beyond Sword and Sorcery. It's definitely got a little gonzo, definitely got a little science fantasy in there. It's definitely 80s fantasy. 80s fantasy, I would say, which is not the same thing as Sword and Sorcery, right? 80s fantasy, much more okay with like heavy metal and like, you know, that's like, we're looking at, you know, heavy metal fantasy at times. And that's totally cool. At least it's totally cool to me. But, I mean, come on, look at that art. So, I recommend you guys check out, again, Gods of the Forbidden North, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Between them, they are, 1,000 pages? 473 pages, 532 pages. Yeah, it's 1,000 pages between Volume 1 and 2. So you're looking at a lot of stuff. Volume 2 is the underworld. Volume 1 is the surface world. So there's a lot to cover there. Okay, still have a lot to go. You know what? I think, guys, I'm going to call this Part 1, and we're going to call it there. For Part 2, we're going to start with some more resources that are maybe helpful in terms of generating a world, in terms of generating ideas, and then we'll go into rule sets that have often a lot of built-in ideas, built-in adventures, you know, packaged in settings and things like that, but also rule sets that are designed to help you play a game of Sword and Sorcery. So that'll probably be Part 2, and I'll put that out as soon as I can relative to this one. All right, guys, well, I hope this has been interesting. I'll put a link below to where you can get all of the things that we've covered so far in Part 1. And I'll see you guys in another video.